Happiness and meditation. An instruction for mental health. From the book, Make Yourself a Master, of the philosopher and conscience master, Jorge Antunes. This short introduction to mental health, based on the book, Make Yourself a Master, by Jorge Antunes, aims to provide the community with a set of premises and guidelines, for the exercise and control of attention. It also intends to promote actions that aim to break some of the socially used reality models, and also to support the process of rupture of the cycle of suffering. 1. All living beings seek happiness. All living beings want to be happy and seek happiness. Regardless of their nature of life, species or race, no living being likes to suffer, except for complex behavioral contexts that can invoke situations of self-punishment and self-harm. Happiness is understood here, in this mental health instruction, as what can be opposed to fear, anxiety, anger, and other negative emotions that result from a personal position and that only depend on our position in a given context. We will try to leave out all the basic physical conditions that may jeopardize it, such as hunger, thirst, physical pain, etc., and that can often not depend directly on our actions. 2. Normal happiness can take multiple forms and be the result of many types of relationships. All of our actions aim at a certain objective, and these objectives may be more or less voluntary or conscious. They can be planned goals, such as the achievement of a more favorable social position, or more or less involuntary actions resulting from emotional patterns present at each moment. These involuntary actions, at the limit, can be designated even as automatic actions, or actions without recourse to the capacity for reflection. Whatever the reason that leads us to action, more or less conscious, it always aims to obtain happiness. That is why it is normal to say that everyone has their own type of happiness. In fact, it is not the feeling of happiness that changes from a living being to another living being at all, but the type of relationship and the object that provides it. Three. Happiness is the feeling of openness in the body. Happiness is an opening of our body, it is something that happens in us, we feel it in us. It is a very deep relaxation that leads to a more or less localized ecstasy or bliss, and that may or may not be the result of a relationship with a certain object or a specific idea. Happiness can take many forms, varying from person to person, but in most cases, it is conditioned to a particular object or idea. Having, being able to have, doing something else or something better, gives rise to mental happiness or conditioned happiness, what we can call the normal happiness. This type of happiness is designated this way, because it is dependent on an external and impermanent context, which requires being fed. All normal addictions, more or less physical and more or less toxic, come in here. It is commonly said that the human being is a naturally dissatisfied being, who always seeks something more and better. Actually, all human beings want to be happy, unconditionally happy, enjoy unconditional happiness. The solution then, is not to satisfy the mind with the conquest of happiness, in order to feed the next objectives and live the struggle to achieve them. The solution is to stop suffering. It is not about what to do to reach a certain level, but rather, what I must stop doing to feel happy. For unconditional happiness is not achieved, we just have to stop feeding the mental patterns that generate suffering. Since happiness is the deep relaxation of the body, and suffering is the tension in which it is subjected, this relaxation implies that there is an earlier tension. Originally, tension does not exist, it develops and takes root in the form of beliefs, traumas and profound prejudices. These blocks or tensions are the hallmarks of our experience and the hallmarks of the way we relate in a given situation. From a very young age we are subjected to experiences of pain and various constraints, typical of life and its social relations and of the relation with things. We are subject to a process of acculturation that, despite humanizing us, reserves a more or less heavy legacy. Seeking happiness based on a perspective subject to this set of tensions, will naturally strengthen the idea of the consumption of happiness, of conditioned happiness that will generate dependence and with that, greater suffering. The solution lies in determining and identifying the root of these blocks and starting the unlocking process. These blocks and tensions together, with the process of acculturation that we were subject to define our personality, are the root of our suffering. The root of suffering lies in the personality. Our conscience has the power to identify itself. As when we watch a movie, or when we play a video game character, we can identify with a certain object or being. It's amazing how we can feel immersed in these kinds of contexts. When we observe children, we can contemplate how our mind provides us with the capacity for augmented reality. We were able to create a whole imaginary scenario and context and add it to the sensory data. It is the same with our mind. We command a body wrapped in a set of personality traits in a story. It is the identification with that personality that limits us, and that after being branched, sustains all the blocks and tensions that we call suffering. Six. To stop suffering is to stop feeding identification and return to live the whole. In life we get stuck in this cycle of suffering, in which things become addictive. However, it is not the things themselves that are addictive, but the way we become dependent on the way they make us feel. We call this the consumption of happiness. Ignorance generates tension. Tension opens doors to the consumption of happiness. The consumption of happiness generates attachment and addiction to objects of consumption. All of this feeds our ignorance even more. The way to break this cycle is to renounce the consumption of happiness and start the process of disidentification. This process of mental deprogramming and reprogramming of attention is called meditation. Our attention is not full, due to mental blocks resulting from identification. As soon as we get total control of our attention, we can observe life without blockages, and with that, obtain the realization of the whole. We are what we think, and we think what we are. Control your attention and change your thoughts, then you can be what you want to be. Seven. Control your attention again, through meditation. It is often said that the ways to achieve the realization of the whole are as many as the number of people who want to achieve it. The meditative process can be more or less physical and more or less intellectual. Your meditative process must be created by you, as you go your way. First of all, it is important to mention the difference between the causes and the effects of a certain process. Being in the present moment, following the heart, state of thoughtlessness, for example, are expressions used to refer to high levels of consciousness and that should not be confused with causes. In other words, these expressions refer to the effects of a cause and not the cause itself. We must not try to be in the present moment or in the absence of thought, because that are the effects of the meditative process and its consequent emotional unblockings and attention control. A more everyday example would be an effort to play complex music on a piano without any training and experience in the art. The ability to play it is an effect of high piano practice and not an isolated cause to follow. What is called inner master in philosophy is your body's positive response to the meditative process, defined here as deep relaxation or ecstasy. In fact, after finding this inner happiness, unconditioned and the result of disidentification, we just have to adjust the meditative process and orient it in its direction. From that moment on, much of the effort that could be used in the process is no longer considered as such, since it will be the body itself that demands the process, in the search to see the desire for ecstasy satisfied. Yes, it is a feeling of immense and indescribable pleasure. Very similar to the ecstasy felt during orgasm. The difference is that the ecstasy felt by deep relaxation is more lasting than a simple orgasm, can last for days, and can be multiple times greater. But yes, it is about feeding a powerful addiction, but in this case, it is a healthy addiction and not dependent on external factors. An addiction to happiness that leads us to eternal peace, resulting from a process that was, is, and will always be available, and not an addiction that makes us dependent on something. This is why drug use is so problematic. There are narcotics so powerful that, due to their unblocking effect, it makes life unsustainable without its perpetual consumption. We are held hostage by these substances, because in addition to the body's need to experience the sensation of ecstasy again, there is also the fact that these substances do not have a permanent unlocking effect. Unlike meditation, in which ecstasy is the result of a permanent release, drugs will only relax the body momentarily. That is why drug use can become the worst addiction that is, and become the path contrary to unconditional happiness. Happiness is the effect of the meditative process of disidentification, and which, during this process, becomes an end in itself. But in reality, the end of that process is eternal peace and the meeting with the whole, and not happiness itself. (8) Analytical meditation. The moment when we renounce the consumption of happiness, and start the meditative process of disidentification and emotional unlocking, can be called initiation. This process, in most cases, must be initiated with more physical practices, more conducive to initial unblockings that are stronger, and which make it very difficult to control attention. Once the process begins, there will be a favorable time for the introduction of the proposed meditation techniques. It is also certain that these processes take some time to achieve the desired effect, deep relaxation. As mentioned, once it has been achieved, everything will become clearer and more predictable. The more time we use to practice the techniques, the better, but of course, considering that they should not imply excessive effort, as this way they can become harmful. Our blocks and the resulting identification are based on two fundamentals, movement and form. These are the basic foundations of the dimension of life. Space is consciousness, where it expresses itself through its movements and its forms. Meditation on form. The human body is not something that can be isolated from the entire universe. Our body is the ground we walk on, the air we breathe, the water we drink, and the sun that warms us. From a very young age, the society that acculturated us, made us believe in an idea of an isolated body, and not interdependent on all being. Therefore, and following the cause of the realization of the whole, we begin the meditative process of disidentification with the form. This simple process of internal investigation is based on analyzing the interior of our body, as if it were a trip, and in a way, dismantling it in its different parts. As we are introducing new images of the body, seen through its interior, we begin to find it strange and to entangle in extracorporeal consciousness. I remind you that this process may take some time to produce effective results, but it is a process without margin for error, and of concise evolution. As soon as the process is sufficiently stable and mature, the same process can begin, but with a focus on the remaining bodies of people who are close to us and who are part of our social life. This is a method to be conscious of the emptiness and the intrinsic existence of the bodies. Meditation on movement. Time is an abstraction, account of movement. There is only the present moment in constant change and mutation. The idea of the past exists, because we have the ability to access a memory. And the future is nothing more than a set of speculations. The day exists during the night, and the night exists during the day. The same is true with the seasons. These differences are directly implicated in the relationship of the Earth to the Sun. If on one side of the planet it is night, on the other side it is day. If in one hemisphere it's winter, in the other it's summer. We can then say that night and day, winter and summer exist simultaneously. In order to unblock the prejudices associated with movement, 3 exercises will be suggested. The first exercise has to do with this higher view. Meditate on the sun during the night, and the absence of light, like at night, during the day. Take an imaginary journey across the planet and beyond. The second exercise focuses on the refeeding of the idea that no time has passed. Place yourself in a space that you have lived with for a few years, such as a space in your home, or an outdoor park. Imagine that, after all, we are not in 2020, but in 2010, and that everything we have experienced so far was the fruit of our imagination. This process, if exercised for several days and a few times a day, will make it possible, at a certain moment, to separate the present from the ideas of the past. The third and final exercise is related to consciousness as an observer, watching the screen of life in our own mind. Let us observe the way in which our mind recreates reality through the senses. The colors, the shapes, the sounds, are all sensations and not the reality itself. Observe the limits of our vision, the way the lines touch the horizon. Said in a sentence, observe the finitude of your senses, and find the infinity of your existence.